We just celebrated Thanksgiving, and now we're at the beginning of Advent as we prepare for the Christmas season. And as we enter into this time of holidays, we think of family. And when we think of family, we think of our children. And when it comes to the faith, as we think about our kids and our children, especially in the culture we live in right now, we wonder, how can we form our kids to keep the Catholic faith? Tonight, I'm going to share the most powerful tool you have as a parent to form your kids in the Catholic faith. What is that most powerful tool to form our kids in the faith? Well, we're going to follow the pedagogy of Jesus himself. He was a great storyteller. He used parables and stories to teach people, to teach the disciples, to teach the crowds. And this has been the ancient lesson of human civilization. All civilizations, no matter what background, ethnicity, has used stories to shape the next generation, to shape children. And our hearts hunger for stories. So joining me today to talk about how to shape the faith of your children is Paul McCusker. He's our creative director for storytelling, for so much creative content we do here at the Augustine Institute. He was a former VP at Focus on the Family, worked on Adventures in Odyssey. He's a prodigious author who has done so many books. So Paul, it's a joy to have you with us.
Thanks, Tim. Good to be here again.
Yeah, you know, I know you have a heart for story, and we talked a lot about how stories are really probably the most powerful tool to shape human imagination and therefore human hearts.
Mm-hmm. Well, in story, as we all know, I mean, I don't know of anybody who doesn't like story and hasn't felt the impact of story because of the way story works. The fascinating thing to me is with propositional truth, for example, you can make a statement and people are immediately deciding, I accept that or reject it. With story, and Jesus did it so well, as you said, it works at a different level. It can work in the imagination, it works in the mind, it works in the heart. And whenever you tell stories, especially if hopefully they're effective or compelling stories, where you've caught their attention, you have good characters, you have a good storyline, it's working in a different way. It's working on the hearts of anybody, adult or children. But the thing that I love is that children are very receptive in the sense of what story can do for them and how it quickens them and brings them alive.
I think there's a sense in which I think you're putting your finger on it that, you know, we could be defensive about propositions. Is this true or this is not true? We kind of get our defenses up, but when it comes to a narrative, a story, we kind of have our defenses down because we're curious. We kind of get taken up into the narrative, and the narrative subtly and slowly unveils meaning and purpose and truths, but it's kind of like our defenses are down. So
What's a different thing when Jesus says, blessed are, or he's answering a question. But when he says, so a man had 2 sons, and then he begins, or a man was traveling on the road, and then he begins to tell this story, and you're immediately drawn in because of a familiar circumstance or something that's compelling. And then there are some who have said it's fascinating because when they're listening to Jesus, some are thinking, is there a religious angle to this? What do you teach? Are you teaching me? Well, then he tells the story and he lets them think about it.
Yeah.
He presents a story that they then take away and they begin to think maybe sometime long afterwards, oh, wait a minute, that's what that is.
I like your point. Stories are sticky, and they stick with us more than facts and figures and, you know, just simple statements. And I want to invite everybody to send us your questions about story, formation of children, and our text line is 720-650-0100. So give us your name and your question, text your question. For Paul and myself, we'd love to hear your questions and have you join our conversation. Well, Paul, you know, I love the idea of stories are sticky. They kind of capture our whole imagination. You know, we talk about the holiday season and bringing kids in and grandkids for gathering the family. But this is a real opportunity. I mean, really, what's really behind even Thanksgiving was Christians who wanted to give thanks to God for their deliverance and for their sustenance. And then, of course, Christmas, you can't get more Christian than Christmas, although people kind of downplays, you know, in our culture, happy holidays. But it's really about Christ and it's about our faith. But we want to equip people to share ways in which they could help form their grandkids or their children in the faith. And you've been writing stories for that very purpose, haven't you?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things, I think very early on, the compulsion, whatever it is that God gave me to want to tell stories from a very young age. And it is interesting, you mentioned Thanksgiving, you mentioned Christmas, which are key storytelling times. Mm-hmm. I grew up with all these stories, whether it is the story of Jesus, the Nativity, Little Drummer Boy, then you move into our cultural stories, whether it's Peanuts, Charlie Brown Christmas, whatever it may be. But we tell those events in the context of a story, not just factual dates, December 25th, whatever. And that's the thing for me is, from a very early age, I was always enamored by story, more than, say, the facts. But the stories always caught my imagination. And I found that in my spiritual journey, stories were always part of every component of my spiritual journey, that it would move beyond facts and theology and make it real in a way that was touching my heart, touching my mind, penetrating in a deeper way, that then moved me on to the next step, moved me on to ideas I would not have had otherwise, but wound up embracing and loving, especially as I've become Catholic.
You know, Paul, I mentioned that ancient cultures would use stories to teach values and key principles and ideas to the next generation, right, to younger people. And there's a real kind of crisis in the church over the last 40, 60 years about catechesis, which means teaching the faith. And, you know, over the last couple hundred years, I would say catechesis became propositional. We have a lot of content we have to download, and we use textbooks, and here's the 7 sacraments, here's the gifts, the 7 gifts of the spirits, and it's kind of, you know, memorize, data dump. You know, and a lot of people reacted to that starting in the 1960s, where they became afraid that all this doctrine and dogma wasn't going to help and reach the heart. And so the idea was, let's throw out doctrine, dogma, memorization, and let's just talk about the person, their experience, and try to apply to the heart. And so you kind of have 2 camps in the church. You kind of the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, which kind of, you know, doctrine, orthodoxy, and then, you know, the personal. Story, I think, is a way to bridge those 2 things together, where you're teaching information that can reach the head, but it also impacts the heart. Explain how you do that you use the Nick and Sam adventures stories. Why don't you talk about Nick and Sam and how these stories are trying to bridge both those parts of the brain?
Well, it's bringing together, I mean, it's interesting to me, even as you were saying that, I was thinking, if we look at church history to a great degree, whenever you detach, say, good catechism from artistry, and you go one direction or the other, you're in danger of diminishing both to some degree. I could argue, and you would know better than I would, that over the years we have lost, one of the reasons our catechism was breaking down was because we lost our artistry in the Catholic Church. They stopped engaging in the arts. It went all catechetical, but then there was no quickening of the imagination to make the catechism come alive in the other way. And that's what, really, this is what the Nick and Sam stories do, for example. So we've got books 7, 8, and 9 in this series.
Yeah, why don't you back up? Let's just talk about, this is a box set of the first 6 books that we produced in the story. Talk about the setting of this story and what the purpose is of this kind of storytelling.
Well, and that's the main thing was, my desire was not necessarily an overtly teaching series, though the goal is always to teach without readers feeling like they're being taught.
Would it be fair to say that the faith is caught more than it's taught?
Exactly.
You're trying to teach it by letting people catch it through the story, right?
And they're living it out. And they're struggling with the things that a lot of Catholic kids might be struggling with, and kids who aren't Catholic, but it's real life. And that was the idea, was to integrate the story and the story of their lives, Nick and Sam, the twins in the Perry family, and they're 7, 8 years old as we meet them, so this is their 3rd grade year, and then the summer series, which is 7, 8, and 9. And these stories really do gently try to integrate a kind of catechism with then the quickening of the imagination through hopefully compelling stories.
Let me you talk about catechism or teaching and storytelling. Give me an example. I know that one of the early books is about Advent. So let's talk about the best Advent ever was one of the volumes.
Right.
And how do we teach about Advent in a story form?
Well, part of that would be, and when I was working on it, I went to the essence of certain things, because I'm always thinking, how are kids thinking about this? What are they anticipating? Well, that was the big thing. They're anticipating. They're looking forward to things. So
And
for
especially
me,
at Christmas.
it was exactly
Yeah.
that. It was, well, Advent is a period of waiting. It is anticipation of something to come. And so I began to work out a storyline that had to do with the church's Christmas pageant and certain things, the kids waiting, doing Advent calendars, and just building an expectation, and then fashioning it to go, well, what is the expectation? Is it just gifts under the tree? What's it going to be? And to reshape that through their perception and understanding. So that's how I often will do this. I'll take a look at, well, what is it? Is it Easter? We're dealing with Lent. We're dealing with Advent. We're dealing with their school year in the first 6 books. You're dealing with the regular school year and now the summer. So I look at these themes and I figure, well, how do I make them come alive through the characters, but letting the reader learn as the characters are learning, or making mistakes, or whatever.
I love that
may be.
because the kids, as you read these volumes, the kids are watching these kids go through a school year, so they can connect to that,
Right.
and then they have friends and problems that they can also connect to, right? Give us some examples of some of the troubles. There's troubles in Lent.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you do with a friend that gets on your nerves, or what do you do with someone who is kind of teases you a bit and it hurts you more than it should? And sometimes the examples or the lessons, little parables, are through the teachers. I mean, one of the teachers that they had, in one of the stories, we do a thing where basically she has them carrying around bags of marbles. And every time they do something wrong, they put a marble in it. And as the days go by, this bag gets heavier and heavier. And now they're finding it's getting in the way because they have to carry all through the school day. They're trying to do other things, or they're playing at recess. Well, then the ultimate lesson proves to be, well, they finally have to go to the priest of the church school, and then they talk to him, and then they get rid of the bags of marbles. And what I was trying to set up gently was a punchline about confession, about how our sins weigh us down, how we do things wrong. Even little things are like these marbles that keep getting added and added. And so it's a chapter. It's kind of one story among many,
but I love that
hopefully
because
make it alive.
they're reading these stories and it's like candy. I mean, the kids love stories, and so they want to keep reading, hear what's going to happen to Nick and Samantha, Sam in short, and so they want to read, and there's humor in the stories, there's adventure, there's all these fun things, and yet they're also seeing the Catholic faith as well as virtue modeled,
right,
in some interesting ways.
And that's something that I think we've lost, obviously, as a culture, is modeling virtue, modeling Christian behavior. You're very hard pressed to find that
Hollywood
intentional.
Doesn't do that?
Well, they're funny about it. They do it by accident sometimes.
Yeah, but they don't do it like they used to.
Most of the time, they're not, and they're espousing and celebrating things that we think would be a mistake.
And I think that's an important point, and that's why I encourage people looking for good, healthy, wholesome entertainment for kids that's also going to be edifying and build up their character and their faith, right? So one of our viewers, Stacy, asks, where do I start if my kids don't have any of the Nick and Sam books? Where should I start? Because you have the first 6 volumes in that box set, which goes through the school year, and it talks about Advent, so which is perfect for this time. And then it's got Lent, which is coming up quickly after Christmas. But then you have 3 new volumes that just came out, Paul, and this deals with after the school year, then they have the summer, and you have one book for each month of the summer, and it begins with the Summer Blast, book number 7, then you have Summer Grace, book 8, and then you have the Summer Discovery, which is going to be book 9. So can they just jump into the summer books, or should they? Do you recommend
it's fair enough.
Start there?
I mean, with the first 6 books, I followed the school year. I want to call it a typical school year. And by the way, the funny thing about these books is we're finding increasingly that the kids are binge reading them.
Yeah.
So they're not reading like one and then waiting another month and then reading another. They are going through them, which is one reason why we did the 3 books all together, and we're going to put it into a nice box set.
And what better to binge on, right? I mean, wholesome, good stories, and there's just not enough of those.
Right,
because kids are hungry for it.
And they're first reader books, so we tried to write them so that they can be read to. The kids can be read to if they're in that age, that 2nd, 3rd, into 4th grade kind of period, depending on the reading level, or they can begin to read them themselves. And many are. We try to make sure the vocabulary, the sentence structure, everything would read well for them. But and these 3 books are actually a story arc, a mystery that they're solving. So we have a bit of a mystery overriding, because I kept thinking during the summer, unlike the structure of a school year, what do kids have? What do Catholic kids often experience? And often it's vacation. They might go to some sort of summer camp, and they usually have a lot of relational stuff going on, the kids that they see or the family that they're engaging with. So that's what I zeroed in on. It was less the structure of a school year and more like, what are the usual, fun, typical things that kids get into in the summer, and that's what the 3 books deal with.
I love that. Well, Beth asks, my grandkids are not Catholic. Is Nick and Sam books going to be confusing, or would it, if they don't know Catholicism, or does it still work for them?
I think it should work for them. I've had non-Catholic readers who have responded to them. They like them. They like them as stories. And I think because of Nick and Sam's age, I'm not assuming they know more than most kids that age would. Even cradle Catholics. I mean, we know even cradle Catholics often don't know the faith to the nth degree. So
I like that. And just an example
that
of that is the way you kind of walk through the Perry family and how they celebrate Advent, and then how they celebrate as a family Lent. You're learning about some of the richness in the Catholic tradition of how to celebrate these seasons, and you're kind of introducing the idea so that if you're an outsider, you kind of get the rationale for some of these practices.
And it's to model, like you said earlier. I thought there are a lot of Catholic families who do struggle with, well, what should we do? What can we do? What would be a fun thing or a good idea to make the faith come alive, or just to bring us together as a family? And I thought the Perry family is a fairly typical family. And so they go through those questions. And then I try to model through some of the chapters and what they do, the kinds of stuff that they do to engage with each other and to celebrate the season within the context of Christ and His church. But not more or less than it ought to be. You know what I mean? I don't ignore it, but I also don't necessarily treat them as so highly engaged that the average reader will go, well, I don't see our family ever being like that.
Well, this is that kind of realism, Paul, is what I like. I'll give you an example. I know in the summer books, Nick, who's one of the main characters in the Perry family, he has a good friend named Riley, right?
Riley, that's right.
And so
Riley.
Riley is interested in all kinds of things like Bigfoot. And I laughed when I saw that, because my son loved the Bigfoot documentaries. And so he would always tease his mother and I that he thought Bigfoot was real. And he was always putting us on a bit, but he was always like, I'm going to find Bigfoot. I'm going to, and he loved this idea of the adventure of Bigfoot. And so Nick has a friend who loves Bigfoot. And what I love is that even though these are wholesome and there's these Catholic threads throughout, there's a realism and an authenticity that kids can connect to too.
Well, and that's what I've tried to, from my own memory, my own experience, but also reading in terms of what kids deal with now. And that is, kids need to recognize themselves in the characters in these books. There needs to be something that resonates with them. And really, the kids just need to be kids, not really precocious and clever, and not necessarily ignorant. The kids have a lot of savvy at these ages. They're absorbing the world around them. So that's what fascinates me about writing for this age, is the kids, just their perspective of the world, but you stay true to them being kids. They're not miniature adults. They're still processing their world. They're processing their faith, relationships. How do I live out my faith with this person or in this situation? So that to me is the key thing, is that it's authentic to the kids' experience, so they'll recognize themselves in the stories.
That's so important for there to be a hook, right? And that's why you end up with the binge reading. These kids want to they fall in love with Nick and Sam. And I love that. Talk about why you chose Nick and Sam. You have these twins, so you got a boy and a girl, so it appeals to the whole family, to both young boys and young girls.
Well, and that's a bit of the sleight of hand here, is that if you do, and it's interesting for this age group, and even later into the teen years, basically, boys are less tolerant in their reading. They will read about boys, but if you give them a book where the main character is a girl, then they may not read it and want to be seen reading something like that. Whereas girls are far more tolerant. They're okay. I mean, we see that from Harry Potter series or whatever.
That's a good example, yeah.
So girls are okay, but you even see the girls in the Harry Potter story playing an important role.
So the title Nick and Sam is a little disguise. Samantha's a girl, but It's kind of hidden in
and
the
we
title.
sort of debated that, and I just like Sam is short for Samantha, and they're twins, but really it was to reflect both, so you have equal forces. So boys can read this and they'll relate to Nick, and I think ultimately, given a chance, they relate to Sam as well.
Yep.
And then girls will read it because they're more tolerant to do it anyway. But really, it was a chance to explore the world from both perspectives, and from equal perspectives because they're twins. So they sort of see things similarly but differently, and that to me was important for the whole series.
I think that's very clever, and it adds a richness to the storyline that's really. And I know a lot of families, their kids have gotten, and I know families with both the boys and the girls absolutely love the story. And that gets me to a question that Justin had in our audience. He said, if you have different aged children or children mixed with boys and girls, how would you recommend a family tackling these books? Do you read it out loud? Do you just have them read it individually? How does that work?
Well, I think it ultimately the families figure it out for themselves. If you have a family where around meal times or at various bedtimes or whatever, parents are reading to their kids, and they've been doing that, and they want something to read to them now as the kids are transitioning into reading for themselves, then it's a great time to read with them. So they're looking at the words, and maybe even let them read a paragraph or a passage or whatever. And then if they're far more advanced as readers, which many kids I find can be at first, second, third grade, then they can read on their own, and they trade them back and forth and share them or whatever the case may be. I mean, I think it's best to read them in order if you can do that. But I also tried to write them so that they will work individually, even if you don't read them in sequence.
If someone gets the box set for the summer books, these 3 volumes are going to be in a box set, right? So if someone gets the box set, they could read these, but then they're going to want to go back and get the other stories, and that's going to work as well. Or you could go back and start with 1 through 6 and then kind of
get to go to those. So, they should work on their own regardless.
Now, Paul, for a little bit older kids, you have another series that kind of follows along. You want to mention what that series is?
We're trying to, in this world of Hope Springs, the town of Hope Springs where everything takes place, I've tried to create basically stories that can work for almost any age group. So actually prior to this, we have the Gabriel's World stories, which are not in print yet, but they're coming. And before that is a pre-K thing called Small Wonders, which all interconnects. But again, you can read them by yourself. They just happen to have Hope Springs as a backdrop. After this then is their big brother, Nick and Sam's big brother is Andrew. And it's called the Virtue Chronicles, and it follows his adventures, but he actually gets pulled into a time traveling situation.
Now, what age group would be the Virtue Chronicles series?
Well, it's funny. I would, if you ask, I would say 10 to 12, 10 to 13, knowing probably older. Well, I've actually talked to kids who are 8 who've read all 3 of those books. And they deal with history. So you've got the first book is Robin Hood, second book is Joan of Arc, and the third book is Edmund Campion and the Elizabethan martyrs.
And a lot of people don't know about that area of that period of the Elizabethan martyrs in England. It's really a window of history that a lot of people don't know, but it's really rich.
Well, and it's hugely relevant to us when you consider our nation was founded on many who had left England, but it was around that time and shortly afterwards. And that is Elizabeth, as a queen, was considered very enlightened and actually very tolerant. And yet the brutality of her persecution against the Catholics during that period was some of the worst in English history in terms of what they did. Now, I'm very discreet in how I handle that in case anyone's afraid. I'm very careful and because I've been doing this for years, I'm very much aware of where the lines are for the ages that I'm writing for, and how not to go across those lines so as to shock or to distress the readers through what I'm talking about. But Virtue Chronicles is next, and so far the response to that has been really good.
Here's a great question that Will asks. How do you get children to engage in reading? It's easy if you gave them a video game. That's easy, right? Or a movie. How do we get kids to engage in books?
Well, the first thing is to try. I mean, you bring them home, and it's always hit and miss. I mean, I've heard stories in both directions where, some kids are very visual. They're either oral or they're visual, and so reading is hard for them anyway. So you read to them. And that's sometimes the way to start. We've seen that with our audio dramas, which is kids are like, audio drama, why would I want to listen to that? And they go, well, let's just listen to the first few minutes of it. And then they want to turn it off, and the kids go, oh, why are you stopping it? We want to hear the rest of this.
Exactly.
So really, you have to guide them in. It's not a matter of throwing the book at them and saying, okay, here, I want you to read this by tomorrow.
I think that's an important point, Paul, because I think it's about starting, right? And once you get them starting to read, like you mentioned the binging of these, and I know families and children who love these stories, but it's about getting them on board and introducing it. And so, as a parent, for me, my wife and I were not beyond bribing our son to start something, right? To read a good book. Like, you read this book, you're going to get, here's some reward, here's a little prize, some little carrot and incentive. And then he starts reading it, and then he wants to keep reading, right? And so I think if you can get them to read the first volume or the first book, they'll get hooked into
Well, it's like
story.
you do with food. You say, well, taste this. You're not allowed not to like it until you've at least tasted it. And it's the same thing. Sometimes you could just say, all right, read the first 10 pages, read the first 2 chapters, see if you're engaged or not. And a lot of times they will be. I just think that, and that's, I think what's beautiful about what we're doing and what we anticipate doing moving forward is not only to have the books, but to use audio and visual arts for these age groups as well, to develop for them so that parents have a fighting chance of using story to present the faith to them, to model it for them in a way other than they're used to.
Yeah. One of the questions that comes up is, where do parents find this, right? And so we have these books on Amazon, but you can actually get a better deal oftentimes at our web store, Catholic.market.
Right.
And so you can go to Catholic.market and get all these books right now, and you can get them in the sets, which is a nice deal. There's a special deal if you get the book sets. And do they make good Christmas gifts?
Well, I would think so. I mean, even though they're summer stories, the fact is Christmas is the time to present, whether it's the Advent story, which I know we're doing a special on.
And then we have Lent coming after that, too.
And then we have these. And again, the wonderful thing about being Catholic is the church gives us, through the church calendar year, multiple excuses to engage. It's much like the Passover in teaching. You know, you have times of the year when you can say, well, a Virtue Chronicle book might be great because it's Joan of Arc's feast day. We have Advent, we have Lent, we have all of these seasons, which is a great excuse to teach, of course, and to instill the faith through that event, but then to present the stories and say, here's a story that's actually about the thing that we're talking about, whether it's Lent or whether it's the end of the school year and the things that the schools often do, or summertime, or whatever the case may be.
Paul, how can people use this as a tool, whether parents or grandparents, to evangelize their children or grandchildren? Is this a subtle, or is it a heavy-handed evangelization?
Well, it's light. It's because it's story. It's light. As I said, you can
touch.
As long as it's a compelling story, people are a bit disarmed. If they feel like it's going to be heavy catechism, they're going to make a different choice. And I know that a lot of grandparents who are concerned about their grandkids, because they're concerned because maybe their kids are not within the faith, or they're not presenting the faith to the kids for whatever reasons. I know in many cases grandparents are buying these things as a way to keep the Catholic faith in front of the kids, again, as a model and as a lifestyle, not as a preaching thing. And then the kids may have questions, they can talk. And we know from a lot of what we do that sometimes through the kids, the parents become re-engaged. The parents suddenly can't answer that basic question about the faith, and they, I should be able to do that. And then they want to engage and learn as well. But I think that's the thing, is just you give them the chance to read it to them, or let them read it, and then let the stories do what the stories often do, as Jesus did, which is tell the story and then let them think about the story and go from there.
Well, and I just want to encourage people. I think the best way to start is, if you haven't started yet, is books 1 through 6. But the good news is, I know kids read through these quickly, and people are always asking, when's the next volume coming out? So bam, now we have 3 that just came out. So they could get that box set. It's a great Christmas gift for your kids, if they can wait for Christmas. But again, I just want to highlight, there's the best Advent ever, and we're at the beginning of Advent. Get this book quickly during Advent, and it's going to be a great blessing for your kids. And then there's the one on Lent, the Troubles of Lent, which I remember reading the Advent one and just laughing on a plane. It's got such great humor, and I love that, Paul. I love the realism that you give, These are real families. These are real characters that people can identify with. And it's just a great joy to read. So you've done a great work. So thank you so much for giving this great resource to parents and grandparents.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Well, next week we are going to have Damon Owens on, and we're going to talk about the theology of the body, which is always been a big topic, and St. John Paul II really brought that to the forefront of the church, especially in our current cultural crisis when it comes to values around human sexuality. So we're going to talk about theology of the body next week, so I hope you can join us next week. And I want to thank everybody who's part of our mission circle. Your monthly giving support for us, if you join the mission circle, just $10 or more a month. We have special society for the mission circle. We do special things for you. But we'd love to have you join and become a mission partner with us if you're not already a mission partner. And I want to thank everybody who does support us with the Mission Circle. It helps us invest in these kinds of books, resources that are going to help the Catholic Church and help form people in the Catholic faith. So we're grateful that you could join us, and may the Lord bless and keep you.